Thank you very much for having us here, Dr. Reitinger and I myself. We are very honored to participate in this very inspiring conference. The host of this morning announced the morning session as a festival of theology, so when Father Baker put the schedule together and put philosophy in the afternoon of the last day, I hope this does not mean that the party is over yet. No, before we really start with our presentation, let me flesh out three main goals of our presentation. The first is a methodological goal, borrowed from Ludwig Wittgenstein, the famous Austrian philosopher, who said, the business of philosophy is not so much to present a solution, but to help us to see some problems more clearly. And that's exactly what we want to do, because we want to take the notion of Creatio ex nihilo as literal as possible. This means that we think creation should be seen as an action, and that nothingness should be taken as literal as possible, which means that there is no such thing that can threaten divine aseity, if we take this notion as literal as we can. And there's a third item in the back of our heads. We are a little bit skeptical regarding a certain translation of creation as the full dependency of the world on God. This may be an interesting notion, but it's not sufficient, because it could turn out that a Platonic world is true, in which you have ideal forms, the Platonic forms, in a transcendent realm, and on the other side you have concrete entities, the concrete things. In such a world, you would have the full dependency of the concrete things on the ideal forms, but there is no creation story necessary. So something has to be different if you tell a creation story from that kind of Platonic metaphysical picture.
Well, I will take the first part, coping with a concept, or let's say coping with the concept of creation. When dealing with the concept of creation from a philosophical perspective, we just have to take into account that we have to consider what are we talking about. So we have to let's have a short glance to the concept of creation, or the concept of creation. So what do we make of conceptual presuppositions? What does this mean? Well, classical theism is talking about creation out of nothing. Creation out of nothing means God in absolute sovereignty creates from the poor nothing the world and man. What does this mean? What does creating mean? Creating, being created. And, well, we can say as a meaningful concept, the notion of creation, this rests on certain presuppositions, on metaphysical presuppositions. And they seem to be trivial only at first glance. Because we might ask whether such presuppositions mirror conceptual connections that are based metaphysical laws. We might ask what the truth makers of such laws are, the truth makers of the ontological commitments. We can say, for instance, the following conceptual connections. If we say for all X is able to create, so the Almighty God, X has the attribute of creativity. Second, for all Y is able to be created, then Y has the attribute of creatability. And third place, for all X has creativity, then X has the power phi. And the other side, for all Y, if Y has creatability, or the creatures, the man and cosmos, then Y has the power C. Well, in classical theism, any power God has to be ascribed to him necessarily, of course. But what is the power God's creativity is rooted in if we conceive him as the ontological ultimate and self-sufficient being, what classical theism is dealing with and is talking about, the God. So we can say, for example, if God has something in mind that's, let's say a little bit in a, just for example, more anthropomorphic, tomorrow I will create the world, but the world is not yet created, but it's just in his mind. Can non-existent but possibly existing beings have powers and possibilities? Because the X has to be created, has the power field, has the attribute of creatability, the attribute of being created. So then we have a conceptual journey, and these are, let's say, a little bit problems. What could be the problems? Because it's a problem, we would just not say that these, the attribute of creatability or the ability to create something, what is here is not really this what we are connected, what we are connecting with the notion of creation out of nothing with a sovereign God. So a possible solution to the problems above mentioned could be, for example, the notion of absolute creation. Absolute creation means theistic activism, for example, God creates everything, and everything here means in the most radical sense of the word. Everything from nothing. That even metaphysical laws, for example, tertio non datur, contradiction principle, conceptual connections and abstract entities like ciphers and other things. That could be one solution, that the sovereign God really is creating everything in the radical sense. Another way could be dealing with these problems by Meinongian theism, Alexis Meinong, this Austrian philosopher, which can be circumcised in the following way. Let's say, first there's a difference between being given to or being conceived by and existing, really existing. So second, thus we can distinguish between given, merely conceived on the one hand, and objects and existing objects on the other side. And so we can say non-existing objects can have attributes, that means with creatability to be created. And creation, so, would be related to the existence of objects, but not to the conceptual giveness of the objects. Well, these two solutions have problems, because while absolute creation may end up in an infinity press, we can ask, does God have to create the attributes he needs to have in order to create in a pre-creation state or something like this? On the other hand, Meinongian theism run against our institution that creation out of nothing has to be radical. Because even given but not yet existing entities, if there are such things, have to be subject to God's creative power. So would it really suffice to say that God has conceptualized them or dreamed them up somehow? How would that account for the giftedness? So these two solutions, the Meinongian theism on the one hand and the other theistic activists, have really costs. So they're prices. But there are also other problems. Why? Limitations to God's creative force. Well, there's a serious problem, the theory of absolute creative phases. Because if there are necessary states of affairs, the truth makers of certain metaphysical laws, as I said, the principle of contradiction, non-contradiction, for example, so even laws of nature, or universes, like say abstracts, other kinds of abstract entities, they seem to have a certain model status that rules out of their creatability. You can say for all x can be created, then x occurs possibly, and occurs possibly not. Second, or the other way, now, for all x is a metaphysical law, then x occurs necessarily. And if x occurs necessarily for all x, then it is not true that x occurs possibility not. And for, now here, x is a metaphysical law, then x cannot be created, which is occurs necessarily cannot be created. So the only way out would be some version of Platonic theism. Platonic theism would say, no, the existence of universal absolute entities are no problems, they are reconcilable with divine aseity, his sovereignty. Or the second solution or way out could be we make a metaphysical trick that distinguishes between obtaining and saying, well, metaphysical law or principle just obtains and only some, let's say, created things exist. So we make a distinction between obtaining on the one hand and occur and existing on the other hand. Or we say, that's what William Craig and well, he wasn't the first one, of course, sparse normalistic metaphysics without any abstract entities, so the anti-Platon, Platonistic way, we just say no, metaphysical eraser, there are simply no truth makers or metaphysical necessities. But all these solutions are not so satisfying, are they?
We have seen a number of initial problems with the concept of nothingness. If you want to find solutions to these problems, one or the other might turn out to put a lot of things in God's head before creation can even start, and not a lot of non-divine stuff, which means this has to be there to make creation work. But there are other challenges. So beyond the conceptual problems, we have serious challenges, and I want to distinguish between the three main challenges. The first one is the concept of causality, which is fishy, at least. The second one is the problem of evidence, which is huge to my estimation. And the third one is the problem of explanation. Does the notion of creation out of nothing really explain anything? And there is another approach available, and this is the reason why one point on our initial charge was coined with the phrase Axiarchic view. I will say something about that in a minute. So, why is causality a problem? Evan Fayos and others would have said that a simple God, the God of classical theism, cannot be causally active, because if you rephrase causation in counterfactual analysis like David Lewis did, this would not work for a simple and eternal God. If causation has to do with the transmission of energy, this would not work for a transcendent God, and stuff like that. Well, we try to stay neutral in that regard, but whatever you want to say, causation seems to presuppose a certain system as in which the causal relation can be established. So there has to be a causal system to make causation work. What is that causal system? We face the very same problems Helmut Hoping has addressed when he quoted Augustine. What is the stuff God creates the world out of? And this is, at a meta level, more or less the same story. What is the system S that is necessary to make causation for God available? Is it already something created that we end up in an infinite regress? Is it the universe? Then this is not a satisfying answer, because the universe cannot serve as a system if the universe has to be created. Or is it God himself, which is also dissatisfying? Maybe there is a way out here. William Craig said all our concepts of causation are more or less attached to physical events and the observation of nature. We should not bring these models of causation to theological playgrounds. So we just say that there is a specific notion of causation which we do not really fully understand, which is applicable to God only. But there is an even bigger problem. It is the problem of evidence. Why do we believe in the creation? So what makes us believe that there is a creation? The traditional answer has been the design arguments, but design arguments have turned out to be a dead-end street, some at least say, since the German philosopher Immanuel Kant criticized teleological arguments. But still, the question of evidence is here, and the rationale behind this question of evidence is a little argument I put on that chart. So, if creation is indeed an action, the products of creation must display certain features that refer back to an action which explains their origin. Let's just assume for the time being, number two, that creation is an action, and then the products of creation must indeed display these features. So what are the features of finite beings or the universe as a whole that tell us that the universe is created, as opposed to being the product of mere coincidence, or as Immanuel Kant would have put it, as being the product of a purely naturally orderly force? Here are a number of examples. John Porter Moreland recommended the argument from consciousness. He would say, well, consciousness is so unique, there has to be something divine behind it. That's the reason why consciousness exists in our universe. But this argument comes at high costs. It is another argument from design, and it has to pay the price of proving that purely naturalistic approaches to the phenomenon of mind are false. Maybe you have a higher level approach. You can find these ideas in Hegel or John Henry Newman. The existence of conscience or the moral realm points to a creator that surpasses the boundaries of nature. But the problem with A and B solutions is that consciousness or conscience are features not every finite being in this universe has. So, if createdness is something every finite being share, what are these features? What we have at the moment are very high-level features, and maybe they indeed point to a divine reality, but they can't be equivalent to a notion of createdness. Interesting is another proposal by Ian McFarland. He says otherness to God is the basic feature. But this is a pretty cheesy answer, to be honest. Why? Well, come on now. Otherness to God is a very formal thing. Nothingness is otherness to God in a way, but nothingness is distinct from createdness. So otherness to God cannot be the answer to the problem. So what is it? Well, he says maybe seatedness in time and space. That's pretty broad. Contingency, that would be another traditional answer. Movement, space and time could be hints. The problem is you need to find features of our reality that really point to a divine direction, that really say, no, there has to be something more that cannot be explained by natural causes only. And the question is whether or not these features can really be explained by natural causes only. Last answer to the question would be a so-called kaleidoscopic view. We are in favor of that view, but it comes with a price tag. You could say, well, a certain interpretation of basic features of our finite entities in the universe and the universe as a whole point to that direction, like the fixity of the past as a presupposition for having a history that turns into a history of salvation, the origination of consciousness as a presupposition to become partners of God in a history of salvation again, and so on. That could be something like hints and traces that point to the createdness of the reality. Even if we can resolve the evidential problem, we still have another problem. If this is true, if we have certain features, do these features really require that God is something like an initial cause, an efficient cause? Or wouldn't it suffice that God has the job of, let's say, a formal cause or a telos of the universe, so that the universe develops into a certain stage or is put on a certain trajectory without an initial creator at the beginning of its existence? And now the biggest problem is the problem of explanation. Does creation out of nothing really explain anything if creation is pictured and compared to an action? What is a good explanation? Some would say a good explanation rests on principles. Derek Parfit, the famous Oxford philosopher, in his last work criticized the creation, belief in creation. He said that this universe with all its features exists as a surprise, but it is another surprise that a creator should exist. You cannot explain one surprise by another surprise. Instead, what you should do is you should stick to a principle, and he is introducing a principle which he has not invented. Nicholas Rescher, John Leslie, and other philosophers already wrote about it in the 70s and 80s. It's, let's say, a Platonic perspective. It's called an Axiarchic principle, which says being is good. So there's a principle of goodness that governs everything. The existence of the universe is explained by this principle of goodness. There is no God necessary that starts the engine of the universe. The universe is there because the principle requires existence to come into existence, so to speak. God could still be in the picture, but not as somebody who creates something, but as, let's say, the primary instantiation of this very principle of goodness. He could be some instantiation of this very principle, and maybe there is even a little hint in the Christian tradition, St. Bonaventure and others, that would say pretty much the same thing. God is not just the creator, he's also the instantiation of this very principle. Now, a very specific answer to the question, what does creation really mean, is that God did not design object, but God brought beings into existence. And you can say that, but you need a specific understanding of the term to exist. And we picked two examples which can be put into a common camp. There is, as you know, another camp, the camp that says existing is not a real attribute, post-Kantian. And if you say that existence is not a real attribute, it becomes really hard to say that God is the origin and the creator of existence. If you can say that existing is an attribute, then to talk about God bringing about existence, the existence of something, becomes meaningful. Our first example is Robert Neville, a theologian who has the most radical notion of existing. He says to exist means to be determined. So everything that is determined is the result of a creation. This would rule out Meinongian theism, because even if God dreams up unicorns that do not yet full-bloodedly exist in concrete worlds, the dreaming up would be a creation story. To determine something is to bring it into existence. There are two interesting consequences of this view. It's the most radical view of to exist. The first consequence is that Neville somehow ends up with an absolute creation story. And this is encouched in his notion of God. God is the most indeterminate being. He is beyond being created, therefore God has to be indeterminate, which brings him very close to some sort of negative theology. The second interesting consequence is that creation has to be eternal. God is pure creative act, eternal act. Why is that? Because to Neville, being temporal is to be determined. So time is already a consequence of God's creative force, so to speak. So God is like this indeterminate nervous being creating eternally, and there's nothing more you can really say about it. Another notion of existence comes from Barry Miller. It's more traditional, it's closer to scholastic ideas. Miller would say existence is something like a grounding or a bounding foundational relation. There is a duality. When we look at concrete objects, we can distinguish between existence and essence, but existence is the presupposition of something to have properties and to have attributes. It's like the basis you need for a painting. Existence is this basis, and then you have the attributes as colors you put on that very basis and ground. Existence is the grounding stuff. The essence is something that shapes and structures this grounding. And now another concept comes inside. God is, so to speak, beyond this duality. His nature is the limit case where existing and essence come together. There is no separation of existing and having attributes in God's case. But what does this do for our concept of creation? Well, we could be tempted to say that maybe God is something like the ultimate motor of bringing together essence and existence in a constitutional bond. But we should be a little bit careful. If we look around, the job of bringing together essence and existence is perfectly done by nature. We don't need God to do it. Maybe God could be seen as an initial force to bring these two principles together, but maybe that's not even required. You could still end up with an idea that God only has the job of a formal cause to unite essence and existence, or as a telos, but that God is not required to play the role of an initial cause. And now, given all these problems, it might be interesting to look in the remaining minutes at an alternative. To us, creation out of nothing conceptually resembles a very expensive German car, like a Porsche. You cannot really drive it, and its technicalities are way beyond your understanding. It might be better to turn to a Volkswagen. You can repair it yourself, and you can steer it, and that's another non-standard notion of God in our case.
But of course, the so-called Volkswagen has its price as well. But it could be, at this point, we thought that the notion of creation in Brussels thought can be an instructive contribution to the debate. Just the last minutes. I just, of course, can't outline the Whiteheadian or the process notion exactly of God and the divine action, but only some points. Well, God is not to be treated as an exemption to all metaphysical principles, according to Whitehead, invoked to save the collapse. He's the chief exemplification, the famous quotation by Whitehead. And God himself is an actual entity. And, well, I will skip the second and go to the third one. Maybe it's more important. God well, provides all possibilities which are actualized by the concrete actual entities while becoming actual himself. So this would be a difference to classical theism and Thomas Aquinas, for example. But in other words, the divine reality is the ground of novelty, the principle for all the permanently proceeding processes of creation. And this has, of course, consequences for the divine action in the world. God is realizing himself by means of comprehensive relationality to the world. But however, Brussels theology does not understand this responsiveness as deficiency, but rather as a quality being an essential part of God's nature. And God cannot act by force in principle. So the justification for this conception is based on the fundamental idea that every actual entity, that means the whole creation, the whole universe, or the whole cosmos, possesses, and at least at a minimum, the power of self-determination and spontaneity. And given that all actual entities, all these events have a certain ontological autonomy, God is not able to control any state of affair unilaterally. And he cannot intervene in the course of natural events or human actions. What does this mean, and now for our topics, for the creation out of nothing? Well, according to many process approaches, not all, for example, I have just a glance to Philip Clayton, not all, the idea of a creation ex nihilo is consistently denied, and the notion of a creation out of chaos is instead proposed. For example, prominently by David R. Griffin. That means God creates the world out of, it's the last chapter, and created primordial material. So God does not exist before and independently of the realm of finite beings. He's not the ontological first cause, an inhibit of the world, but only its master builder, let's say, imposing order upon a state of chaos and being subject to the conditions of the process principles. So in this view, there's already something outside God, but it would be more chaos. And for this form of existence, just devoid of higher significance, and without God's initial aim, the actual entities would remain chaos, only prehends the time by means of their physical pole. And only with God's initial aim, there could be some novelty into the world introduced in the process of becoming, and this is this to tell us that God's aim consists of increasing, promoting the enjoyment of the creatures. Of course, this is had its price because you have to, let's say, modify some crucial points of Christian convictions. But well, this is could be maybe an instructive contribution to the debate, just as I said.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.